Right, I think we shall get started. So welcome to New Ways to Think About Dyslexia. I'm L Clements. You can pronounce it however you like. I really enjoy variety. And I'm going to have a very practical and interactive approach to this time today. In my experience, usually people who come to a workshop like this are coming because they have an experience with dyslexia. Either they are dyslexic, or they have somebody close to them who is dyslexic, or they are working with people who are dyslexic. And so I wanted to make some space for us to work on whatever it is that you would like to work on regarding this. So I'm just going to give a kind of a starting prompt, and then we're going to collaborate a little bit, and then I'll give some more input, and then we'll see what we can do together that might be helpful for anybody. So what I want to say, first of all, is simply that I got interested in dyslexia for two reasons. The first being that dyslexia runs in my family, and that because as a self-directed education facilitator, I also encounter a lot of kids who have come to self-directed education because they've been diagnosed with various DYSs in their other schools. And then secondly, because Daniel Greenberg, the founder of Sudbury Valley School, wrote and said that he's never encountered a case of dyslexia in now more than 5 decades. When I first came across it, he said it, in more than 4 decades. So that really got me investigating. And when I investigated, what I found is that it's not only at Sudbury Valley School. Pretty much every educational facility and home that follows a thoroughly self-directed approach finds that a reading difficulty specifically doesn't arise. So there could still be other signs of dyslexia. Daniel Greenberg and Peter Gray disagree with me that there is a dyslexic neurology. At this point, they've both said to me they don't think dyslexia exists at all in any way. Personally, I experience that there's a dyslexic neurology that's there, whether or not there is a reading problem. But it does seem to be possible to have a reading difficulty without having the neurology that I would consider to be dyslexia. And it seems possible to have the neurology that I would consider to be dyslexia without ever developing a reading problem. And that's where I'm very interested in drilling deeper into that. I don't think I'm anywhere near the end of that adventure. I don't claim to be an expert, but I do think it's very, very fascinating. And what I've already managed to articulate, I think, is already quite useful. So having said that, what I'd like to do now is actually put up a whiteboard, and let's jot down how we currently think of dyslexia, because depending on who is here and how we are currently thinking about dyslexia, that's going to guide what will be most useful to do today. I don't know whether you can write on this, or if I can give you permission to write on this. You can give it a try, but if you don't want to or you can't, I'm also waiting to be a scribe over here. So if anybody wants to, feel free to do I have to unmute you? I don't think so, do I? Then feel free to just unmute yourself, and let's write down, how do you currently think about dyslexia? What comes to mind for you when you think of dyslexia, or what do you think it is? How do you think it functions? What are the issues? Let's write it all up. Who's got one for me? Okay, I'll get you started. Most people think of a reading disability.
Tantrum.
Okay. Sorry, could you speak up there?
Tantrum. Showing tantrum. Behavior problem. Tantrum. Tantrums.
Tantrums.
Yes.
Like throwing tantrums, getting upset.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Tantrums.
Inability to spell.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Anything else?
It arises as a result of pressure to read.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anything else? Does this cover it for everybody here?
Well, no memory of how words look.
Mm. Yeah, that kind of lack of the sight word thing that most teachers rely on us having. Okay, anything else? How else do we think about dyslexia? What else do we think of in relation to dyslexia? It's fine if this is all there is, that's not a problem. But does this cover it for all of you completely? Reading disability, tantrums, inability to spell, dyslexia arises as a result of pressure to read, no memory of how words look.
No concept of phonemes.
Mm-hmm. No concept of phonemes. So that idea that, you know, ENG is eng and ING is ing. Anything else come to mind? So welcome if you've just joined us. We're just quickly collecting all our thoughts. We're just quickly collecting all our thoughts on the whiteboard. Feel free to unmute and just say anything that comes to mind for you personally when you think about dyslexia. How do you understand dyslexia? Okay, then let's start with that because we've actually got quite a bit already there. Now, I am guessing that what Sid said here about arises as a result of pressure to read might be new to people other than Sid. Is there anybody else? Can we just see a raised hand or something? Is there anybody else who's already thinking of dyslexia as something that arises as a result of pressure? Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about this concept then. So what we find when we have a look at the facilities where dyslexia doesn't arise. Yes, sorry, Najmi, did you want to speak? Please do.
Sorry,
No.
just to answer your question, that I do feel dyslexia arise from the pressure. Yeah, so please continue.
Yes, yes, okay. So what we see in the facilities where dyslexia doesn't arise and the homes where dyslexia, well, where the reading, let's say, where the reading disability doesn't arise, is they're all characterized by an almost complete lack of pressure. So this, in terms of time, so there's no particular deadline by which you must learn to read. And there's also no particular method by which you must learn to read. There's no particular materials that are acceptable. For example, when I was growing up, I was told that comics were not reading material. You had to read a book, for example, whereas in places and homes where there's no pressure, there's also no kind of value judgment about any written material. You know, texting on your phone or words on a computer game or the TV manual are still reading. There's also no shame attached to whether or not one can read. And there's also a lot of support for the person as a whole person and as a capable, talented, able person, regardless of their capacity to read. So there's really no pressure at all. I would like to, in fact, just get out of this full screen view here. It seems to me that there are a few things that come together to create a reading problem. And I'm going to just paste the whole lot up here so that we can have a look at them and unpack them one by one. And I'm going to put them next to the other things on the whiteboard so we can also have a look at how they might relate. Let's see if I can paste here. I hope I can. Yes, fantastic. It looks like I'm going to have to move things around a bit, if you'll bear with me for a second to make some space here. Right, let's just move this down. Okay, and then I'm going to move this up and see if I can fit all these words in one place. Let's have a look here. Right, so in fact, we can just dispense with this first sentence. 7 things come together to guarantee literacy in terms of a functional level of eye reading. So the first one would be the hardware. There needs to be vision, and there needs to be neurology that's capable of reading. However, the mainstream assumption seems to be that dyslexia is a neurology that makes it hard to read. Whereas I haven't seen any evidence that dyslexia is a neurology that makes it hard to read. It definitely makes it hard to spell. And Sid, if you're looking for a solution to that one, I haven't found one yet. It seems to help, you know, reading a lot seems to help, and no pressure seems to help. But the spelling issue seems to me to remain, and it's one of the ways we can spot the dyslexics who don't have a reading problem. However, I want to just attack quickly that idea that it's an inability to spell, because in my experience, dyslexia is the opposite of an inability to spell. It's actually an incredibly powerful creative talent for spelling. It's just that it's a creative talent that wants to do it the way that it feels like in this moment that makes sense. Just like we will dance slightly differently, draw a slightly different picture, why don't we spell it a different way? The mind doesn't seem to fix on a particular accepted spelling for the word. Instead, it thinks like, how could I spell this? How should I spell this? And depending on how much attention there is in that moment to the task, will also depend how the word is spelt. It might have a lot of things left out because the brain is already filling in the pieces that are left out, because there's enough clues there to know what the word is. Or it might be very meticulous and overspelled with extra letters in it, because the focus is trying very hard to make sure that we spell it, and is that F going to be an F or a GH this time, because I know sometimes. So that's where that that focus on the word spelt in a conventional way just isn't a natural place for a dyslexic mind to go, I believe, because the dyslexic mind is actually so creative and so capable. So just like somebody with glasses is still within the hardware range, if you like, for reading, even though it's maybe not optimal, the dyslexic mind is still completely within the necessary range for fluent reading. You do find people who are outside of that range, but I don't think that has got to do with dyslexia as such. It actually has to do with brain damage. You can actually damage the part of your brain that can decode symbols, and then you really do have a reading disability. But that doesn't seem to apply in the case of dyslexia. So what does? Let's have a look at the other things that have to come together. So number 2 would be development, matter of readiness. And this, I think, is where we mostly see children struggling with reading, in that most schools and homeschooling families want to see reading happen at about the age of 6 or before, sometimes 7, definitely by 8. Whereas when we look at the research that people like Peter Gray have done, we find that the average age, it ranges from about 4 to 14. Of course, you can get a few outliers. You get children as young as 2 who get then diagnosed with hyperlexia. You occasionally might get somebody over 14, but generally we're looking at the age range of 4 to 14 in terms of developmental readiness to learn to read. And if we're going to expect somebody to learn when they're not developmentally ready, then we're not going to see optimal results, and we're going to start reducing their confidence. The third thing that has to come into place is that there needs to be a literate environment, including access to literate people who will answer questions. Just like anything else in self-directed education, we want to be immersed in whatever it is we're going to learn, because the instinct is to master the tools of the culture. And if you're not seeing it all around you, then it's not exactly a tool of the culture. Whereas if you're in a literate environment where there's printed material, text in the digital, and you're seeing other people read, then you pick up that it's a tool of the culture. And if you have access to literate people who can tell you what this says and what that says, then that's also one of those necessary things that has to be in place, which is why we see maybe people who are not in a literate environment won't necessarily naturally learn to read. But what comes to mind for me is many, many years ago, I was working with my mother with some street kid projects. And the one little guy that she came across had taught himself to read by being a newspaper seller on the corner. And that was his literate environment. And as a consequence, he spoke in an amazing kind of journalese, because English wasn't his first language, and he learned to read in English, and that's also how he learned English. And so he spoke of words like absconded. I absconded from the shelter rather than I ran away. So then the fourth thing that needs to be there to pretty much guarantee the ability to eye read, and I'm going to just quickly also distinguish eye reading from ear reading and finger reading. Finger reading would be Braille, ear reading would be listening to audiobooks, eye reading. There needs to be autonomous motivation to learn to read. So it needs to be because I want to do it for my own purposes, not because I feel I ought to, because I've been told I have to, because I'm going to be punished if I don't. So that autonomous motivation is another place where we can end up creating a problem. When we try to motivate somebody to learn to read, we're actually denting their ability to learn to read by putting on the pressure, which is where the thing Sid said here of it arises as a result of pressure to read. That very much has bearing on that autonomous motivation, and then on the next item, which is freedom from imposed pressure. So we need to be free from pressure, and we also need to be free from imposed method. So what we found is that in those facilities where there's real self-directed education, a real self-directed education environment, nobody cares how you learn to read. You don't have to sit down and get your ABCs first and then put them together in a particular way. You don't have to do phonics. You don't have to do whole word. You don't have to do contextual reading. People don't even necessarily insist on knowing how you are learning to read. It's allowed to happen in a completely invisible way. I don't know if any of you were at my talk earlier. Well, I know a couple of you were at my talk earlier, but it can happen completely through intrinsic structure where nobody knows what's happening. Even the learner isn't conscious of how they are learning. And I actually recently got another beautiful example of this from one, from a paper that's a draft paper by Eugene Matusov, where he's talking about his own learn to read experience, because he's dyslexic. And he had been trying so hard, and everybody had been trying so hard to teach him, and he wasn't getting anywhere. And then one day he woke up in the morning and suddenly he could read. Like an epiphany. It was just suddenly the words made sense and he could look at them and he could read them. So that freedom from imposed method is important. And then the final one, which I think is key to dyslexia, in a very particular way, is matched level of effort. And Sid, this might be where your adult dyslexic might want to have a look at this one. I was very, very interested when I first started looking into dyslexia, when I came across the work of Ron Davis. I don't know if anybody's come across The Gift of Dyslexia by Ron Davis. So Ron Davis taught himself to read, I think it was at 16. This is a while ago now that I read this material. He actually couldn't speak into his early teens. So he made a lot of sudden strides forward in his upper teens. And then he codified what he had done for himself into a method that could be used therapeutically with other people, which is quite a complicated method that involves putting your attention behind your shoulder, for example, And I was fascinated with why would that work? And as I explored dyslexia more, if we look at the dyslexic brain as a talented brain, a brain that is talented in multidimensional processing, 3D modeling, being able to see the whole picture and all the links, the brain is really, really good at doing this, which is also where you get that famous dyslexic thing that most people associate with dyslexia of turning things backwards and upside down and scrambling them. And my son, when I told him about Ron Davis's method, because I was looking at getting Ron Davis therapy for my son, who I then had realized was dyslexic, he said to me, he translated what I was saying into his own creative way of understanding. And he said, "You're telling me I have to change gears when I try to read." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess that's what he's saying." And my son picked up a book and started reading. And then he got tired and he scrambled a couple of words. And I said, "I think you've slipped gears." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he carried on reading correctly. And what I've perceived there is that because the dyslexic brain is actually quite powerful at doing this, when they try hard, trying hard for the dyslexic brain means doing this, right? Not trying hard means doing this. So if a dyslexic brain is trying extra, extra hard to read, they're going to do this more. And guess what the result is going to be? So that matched level of effort is really important. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the lack of imposed pressure and the lack of imposed method is very important in terms of preventing the problem from developing in the first place. Because if we're not putting pressure on them, they're not going to be trying so hard. If they're not sitting under the feeling that I ought to be able to do this by now, their effort is more likely to be matched and relaxed and capable when all of those other 6 factors are in place. Whereas the more that they're trying really hard, the more likely they are to still be frustrated in spite of the rest of it being in place. And if some of those others have also been impacted, then that's when we have the possibility of creating a lifelong learning struggle. Because we can pretty much write off number 1, because if you've got a problem with the hardware, with the vision and the neurology, if you've got a problem with that aspect, then we're not talking about dyslexia. We're talking about brain damage or eye damage. Whereas if we're talking about the other conditions, if you have impacted things at the level of development, at developmental readiness, you're asking somebody to read before their brain is ready to read. Now we've created a stress and we've created a sense of I can't, and a self-perception that this is difficult for me, or maybe even, unfortunately, I am stupid, is one of the tragedies that tends to happen to kids with dyslexia. So you can impact it there at number 2. If you don't have a literate environment, obviously it's going to be less likely that somebody will pick it up quickly. But in the world that we live in, ultimately the environment is so literate now that it's almost inevitable. Even if you live in a home where there are no literate people, like the little boy I spoke about who learned from the newspaper, there's still print all around you and text all around you. It's just highly unlikely that anybody in this day and age, unless you live somewhere very remote, you're going to have enough of a literate environment that if everything else is in place, it's still going to happen. Then the autonomous motivation, we can dent it there by taking away their motivation. I don't know if any of you have attended my talks on motivation, but when we reward people or over encourage them or give them too much praise, it actually can steal their autonomous motivation and turn it into controlled motivation. So even if we're not trying to force them and punish them and threaten them, and we're actually doing the positive thing, we can still negatively impact their motivation. So one little boy that I was aware of, his father offered him a new computer and his computer game that he most desired if he would learn to read, and that made it so much harder. because it becomes number 5, freedom from imposed pressure. So we can impact over there by putting pressure on. There's enough pressure for a child to learn to read. Every child looks around, sees that everybody's supposed to read, is aware if their peers are starting to read before they have. There's already going to be pressure there, and we need to lighten it as much as possible. We need to, as much as possible, be giving that message of it's okay. Everybody does it at a different stage. You will get there when you get there. We can also impact it at number 6 by trying to push a particular method. Also because some methods really don't fit with the neurology. So a phonics-based method, for example, is often used to remediate dyslexia, but a phonics-based method might also be the least natural for that particular person to try and grasp. And if the phonics method is the least natural for that brain to do, then that's going to also make it harder. And then finally, that matched level of effort. If we've impacted things at any of those previous levels, then the dyslexic child is likely to be trying hard at that point because of the previous impacts, which can really be the nail in the coffin, which is where we can end up with somebody as an adult who doesn't have functional literacy because more than one of these things has been impacted and it's gotten too heavy. So to have a look back quickly at these other things that were set up, yes. This is where you can also see tantrums, because frustration and also an instinctive sense of injustice, because on some level that intrinsic self is going to feel that I will do this when I'm ready, I could do this when I'm ready if you would stop impacting me. And so yes, that can also then lead to where we see that dyslexia is overrepresented in the prison system ultimately, because that kind of combination of I'm stupid and I can't do this and I'm sick of it and I need to just break loose and kick back because I'm not actually going to manage anything positive can be one of the tragic outcomes. Just going down the list of things that were listed here as well. We haven't touched on, no memory of how words look. That sight thing is one of the clues to dyslexia, that there'll often be more of an ability to recognize a word like house, which is a concrete thing. So it kind of gets an association, whereas the might be quite hard to learn, even though it's a short, simple word, because there isn't that automatic memory for the word pattern or the word shape that associates to the sounds, maps to the sound, the. And you often find that struggle with short words that doesn't make sense if you're not aware of it, which again speaks to that powerful dyslexic brain, that it's often moving too fast to notice the small words, or to fix on the things that are too abstract. I'm going to stop the share now and come back into interaction. So thoughts on all of that and further questions and particular troubleshooting. Now's the time. So what would you like to bring? Sid, go for it.
We did discover Ron Davis's book, and my son went and did therapy with that method for a while. He had to commute from the island where we lived to the mainland, so it was quite a process doing it. And my understanding was that part of Ron Davis's perspective is that dyslexics are so capable visually that it's not that they flip them it's also that they can see them from all different angles.
Yes.
And so they're able to visualize a letter as a three-dimensional object.
Yeah.
And they don't keep it in one view, which is why it's hard for them to read, because it doesn't stay in the right place.
Yes.
It's interesting to see it as a strength rather than a weakness.
But
it still gets in the way of locking into that one perspective that they talk about, and which is why you look at it from over your shoulder.
Yes.
But I don't know if he didn't do it long enough or what. it didn't seem to really, well, I don't know how much it impacted it. I'm not in his brain. You know, it's impossible to really tell. Um, the way he learned to read, I think, most successfully was because he was working at a video store and he had to dust all the covers of all the movies.
Right.
And he was motivated to learn what those movie names were. So that was the motivation kick for him. And he since has become this collector of it's this huge library of movies, and he still buys them and watches them, and he listens to more books on tape than we have ever read, probably.
Right.
So in that way, he's a very literate human being. And this notion that we have to do it, you know, by interpreting symbols visually as the only way of reading is a fairly outmoded notion, I think.
Yes. Absolutely.
So he has gotten better at reading because he's been motivated to do it. He still doesn't read books that way because he's discovered it's so much easier to listen to them than it is to read them.
There, yeah.
But
even for people who can read, yeah.
But he'll read things until he gets into a situation where there's some kind of pressure, like if he gets an official document from somebody and he's not sure he's interpreting it right, you know, he'll just hand it over and say, "What's the deal?" You know. And I don't know, in fact, if the pressure he put on himself originally when he was in school as a kindergartner was what kicked off that pressure effect. You know, it may not have been the outside pressure then. It may have been the pressure that everybody else could read. Why couldn't he?
Yeah.
And so he already thought he was stupid. And then when he got to the next school after 3 years of homeschooling, the pressure was intense. You know, so that sort of finished it off. And if you get help from a one-on-one person, that makes you feel even more stupid.
It can, if it's not consensual.
Right. Yeah. So it's a pretty amazing thing because I've spent his whole life trying to rebuild his confidence.
And ironically, when he did the Ron Davis remediation, he may also have been feeling that he has to make this work, you know, he has this thing. But again, it was actually somebody else's method. I mean, this is the irony of methods like Davis's. It worked for Davis to look from behind his shoulder. It didn't work for my son to look from behind his shoulder. It worked for my son to think of changing gears. And that's the thing, is that dyslexic minds are very, very creative. So the moment that we tell them not to do it their own way, we've already created. In fact, there you go. You've given me number 8 because I love 8. It's my favorite number. So there's number 8. It's like I suppose it's already there in freedom from imposed method. Even if it's an alternative method, even if it's a remedial method, we need that freedom from imposed method. But I want to just also comment on what you've said there about your son, because I think it's very, very important, you know, to put pressure on people to eye read when they can ear read, and when they have people around them who can help them eye read when needed, and they have in these days even software that can eye read for you when needed. It feels very unjust and tragic to put pressure on people under those circumstances. I have a friend with retinitis pigmentosa, which means that his vision has been gradually shrinking for the last few decades. And he can now focus on something about the size of a few pixels at a time. It's like looking through a straw, like this. And I mean, he just uses text to voice for all of his reading needs. And he's an academic, he's a professor. So why are we putting on so much pressure and giving people so much shame around this demand that they eye read? Anybody else who's here who'd like to share something, ask something? I'm curious to know what everybody else's experience with dyslexia has been, because I don't think you'd be here if you didn't have an experience.
Hi, I will, I think this is super interesting. I don't have a lot of experience with dyslexia, but I do have, one of the kids in my program is, I suspect dyslexic, and can't stand anything remotely related to reading. He's able to, but chooses not to. So I think referring it to iReading is, hadn't thought about that before. I guess I think the biggest challenge is trying to communicate with the parents who, unfortunately, one of them really doesn't get the strength of doing a more self-directed approach and letting him find his own solutions into, you know, how to navigate his education in his own way. And so they are actually pulling him out of my program to put him into a school that is going to be more labor intensive, and he's already just shut down so bad that it, and I just guess I don't know how to help or speak to the parents in that regards to get them to understand that, you know, there are other tools he can use to be able to accomplish the tasks that he needs to accomplish in life, whatever that may be. We don't even know, you know, with the whatever the future in the technology that's available to us. We don't even know what resources are going to be available. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to get through to people who just want to keep pushing and pushing. It's like, it is literally like beating your head up against the wall. I just feel like it's so counterintuitive.
Do you think they would be willing to look at, read something themselves or watch a video themselves? Do you think they'd be open to that?
So yeah, a video would be great if I could send it, especially to his mom. I know she'd be ultra receptive to that.
Okay. So I'm just looking for this channel.
While Jen shared the channel, I just want to share with Laura, if I may.
Yes,
I
please
mean,
do.
my knowledge on dyslexia is not, you know, just a little, but one of the things that we did for parents, especially for during briefing before school year starts, is to sit down with parents and talk about reading and writing. So one of the things that I do is that I give handouts, and in that handouts is a whole paragraph of symbols, right? You can totally open up document, and then you just type in whatever that you want to type in, and then select the font symbols and then change it, you know, just change it. So we give that. And then I told the parents, you've been to school, you are, you know, university graduates, you have your degrees, your work, your accomplishments, now read. You know, I say that. And then that's in on the reading part, and then on the other on writing part, I asked them to write with their non-dominant hand, and just sit in the process. And we had a whole discussion. Sometimes it can goes up to 2 hours just discussing on that. So the whole idea is just to bring parents to understand. I mean, coming together to understand at that point of the child's feelings about reading and writing first, before going into all the other theories and whatnot. Usually it works faster with the mother, with the mothers. But it does sometimes work with the fathers as well, because, you know, sometimes the fathers will go like, sure, this thing, you know. But yeah, that's some of the things that maybe you would want to try with your parents and see how it goes on your part. So I
absolutely love that. That is just such a creative, experiential way to give them that empathy for the child that can really shift their perspective. That's fantastic. Who came up with that one?
I want to take the credit, but it's actually Dr. Putri. So because I was working with her, you know, we were just trying to figure out how can we bring parents to that level, because you know, like you said, Jen, when we don't know when we know how to read, and we totally forgotten about that already, especially now that we're adults. So it's just trying to find ways to just bring parents, you know, from here down to the child's level, just to understand first before we work together, you know. So in that sense, so yeah.
Wonderful, wonderul. So
well, I like that because I think it also demonstrates that even if it demonstrates using tools to be able to figure things out. And because I mean, we're capable of doing that. Our children are too. And I think sometimes parents forget that. That's more important than actually being able to sit down and just read a book or whatever.
Yeah.
It's, you know, and I think we're at such an advantage now with the text, the ability to speak and text and, you know, have the audiobooks and all of that, you know, and, you know, even with the AI technology, it's developing so quickly. So I think people with those learning challenges or I don't even want to call them learning challenges, those, what we've considered as disadvantages in the past aren't really. They don't need to be. It's, you know, the same way as if somebody had a physical disability, we have ways to work around that.
Yes.
Feel free to use the tool in you know, your parents' briefing or anything like that, because it really helped to come together to talk to them about it, because otherwise it's, you know, talk about, you know, the dyslexia and whatnot, but then if they're not there, they don't see what we see, it's really hard. So yeah.
So Sid has put a website in the chat, and I've also put a YouTube link in the chat. I highly recommend that YouTube link. It's 2 remedial teachers talking about this topic, and the one remedial teacher has already woken up all the way to run her own self-directed facility and only offer assistance to young people who have asked her, you know, who want to be there, so that it's not imposed, it's coming from autonomous motivation. And the other is on their journey in that direction, and the conversation the 2 of them have is really very, very moving. Then I've also put just the address for my website. It's very simple. It's just my name, lclements.com. And on there, I've also got a little booklet called What If School Creates Dyslexia. It's a very quick and easy read. It's just that thick. It's available in ebook. The print is available right now in pre-order in French and in English. If they're willing to look at those resources, I think that's probably your best bet. Because the thing is that in my experience also, I'm sure, is it Najmi? Am I saying your name correctly? You know, when we're running facilities, what we find often is that as much as we can sit down and work with the parents, and maybe they're going to respect what we're saying because like we're the teacher, also not. You usually need that outside expert voice from somewhere else to back you up. So if they're willing to have a look at those resources, it could help.
Thank you. Okay. Saving all this. Yep.